All right, let's do a deep dive into the world of airspace.
Airspace, huh?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, we see planes flying around, we hear them overhead, but what's really going on up there?
It's more complicated than you might think.
That's what I figured.
There are rules, regulations, different types of airspace. It's like a hidden world above us.
Like a highway system in the sky.
Exactly. And we got our hands on some official pilot training materials to guide us through it.
So consider us your air traffic controllers for this journey into the world of airspace.
And whether you're a frequent flyer, a drone hobbyist, or just curious about what's happening above your head, this is going to be a fascinating ride.
Plus, I gotta say, as I was looking through this material, one thing really caught my eye. Did you know there are actually places in U.S. airspace where flying is completely prohibited?
Oh, yeah,
Not just restricted, but totally off limits.
absolutely. We'll get into those later. But first, let's lay the groundwork. Like, how is airspace even organized?
Yeah, where do we even begin with this airspace thing?
Well, imagine the sky is a giant layered cake.
Okay, I'm intrigued. A cake.
Yeah, the airspace cake, and the two main categories are controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace.
Okay, so two main slices of cake, controlled and uncontrolled.
Right.
Makes sense. But why not just have it all be uncontrolled? Wouldn't that be easier?
You'd think so, but it's actually more like, think of it like roads. We need both freeways and local roads.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Controlled airspace is essential for areas with high traffic, like around major airports,
Right, makes sense.
or for high-altitude flights where those big jets cruise.
So it's like the freeway system of the sky, keeping things moving smoothly.
Exactly. And just like freeways have stricter rules and more infrastructure, controlled airspace requires things like communicating with air traffic control.
Oh, I bet that's important.
Definitely. Specific pilot certifications and sometimes even special equipment on the aircraft.
So it sounds like there are different types of controlled airspace, just like there are different types of roads.
You got it. Controlled airspace is further divided into classes,
Okay.
A, B, C, D, and E.
All right, so there are layers to this airspace cake.
Exactly.
And each layer has its own set of rules.
That's right, based on factors like the type of aircraft flying there, the complexity of the airspace.
And this is where all those letters and numbers on aviation charts come into play, right?
Absolutely. It all starts to make sense when you understand the different classes of airspace.
Quay, I'm ready to dive into those classes.
All right, let's start at the very top layer with Class A.
The penthouse suite of the sky.
You got it. It starts at 18,000 feet above sea level and extends up to 60,000 feet. That's where you'll find those big jets zipping across the country.
Wow, so next time I'm on a cross-country flight above 18,000 feet, I'll know I'm in that exclusive airspace reserved for the big jets.
You'll be right in the thick of it.
Cool. So what makes Class A so special? What are the rules up there?
Well, because of the altitude and the speed of the aircraft, it's all about efficiency and precision up there.
Right, like you can't have planes just weaving in and out of each other up there.
Exactly. So all flights in Class A airspace operate under instrument flight rules, meaning pilots are relying on their instruments and communicating with air traffic control for every maneuver.
So visual flight rules just wouldn't cut it at those altitudes?
Nope, too risky.
Okay, so Class A is all about instruments and precision.
It's like the express lane of the sky. Everything is very controlled and monitored.
Gotcha. All right, moving down a layer in our airspace cake.
Okay.
What's Class B all about?
Picture this. You're approaching a major airport, like JFK or LAX. The airspace around these airports is Class B.
All right, I've definitely been in that situation.
It's often described as an upside-down wedding cake because it has multiple layers to accommodate all those planes taking off and landing.
An upside-down wedding cake, huh?
Yeah, kind of a funny visual, but it works.
It does, it does. But why so complex? Why is it different from Class A?
It all comes down to traffic. Class B airspace surrounds the busiest airports in the country, so there's a much higher risk of planes getting too close to each other.
Yeah, that makes sense, like a busy intersection.
Exactly. And just like in a busy intersection, you need traffic signals and rules to keep things from getting chaotic.
So Class B is all about minimizing those close calls.
You got it. Now, to enter Class B airspace, pilots need explicit permission from air traffic control.
Okay, so it's not just a free-for-all.
Not at all. And once they're in, they're constantly talking to ATC, who guides them every step of the way.
That sounds like a lot of pressure, both on the pilots and on the air traffic controllers.
It definitely is a high-pressure environment, but that constant communication and coordination is what keeps those busy airports running smoothly and safely.
Makes sense. All right, so we've tackled the top two layers of the airspace cake. What's next?
Let's move down another layer to Class C and Class D airspace.
Okay.
You'll find these around smaller airports that have control towers, but they're still carefully regulated.
So if Class A is the express lane and Class B is a busy intersection, would it be fair to say that Class C and D are like navigating a busy city street?
I like that analogy. Class E airspace usually extends up to 4,000 feet above the airport, while Class D goes up to 2,500 feet.
So a little less vertical space to work with.
Right, but the key thing here is two-way radio communication with the control tower is required in both.
Like checking in with the crossing guard before you enter a busy school zone.
Yeah, exactly. So even though these airports are smaller, there are still rules in place to keep everyone safe.
Safety first. Now, you mentioned earlier that sometimes pilots need special equipment to fly in certain airspaces.
Yeah, I was just getting to that. Class C, for instance, requires a piece of equipment called a transponder.
A transponder, what's that?
It's basically a device in your aircraft that sends out a signal with your altitude and location so air traffic control can track you on their radar.
Oh, so it's like having a GPS tracker that helps ATC see where you are even if they can't see you visually?
You got to think of it as an extra layer of safety and awareness for everyone.
Interesting. So if I'm flying into a smaller airport with a tower, I should always check the airspace classification and make sure I have the right equipment and follow the rules.
Always a good idea to be prepared.
Absolutely. Now, what about the last type of controlled airspace, Class E?
Ah, Class E. This is where we finally get to those wide open spaces, at least to some extent.
Really?
Yeah, Class E covers a vast amount of the U.S., especially at higher altitudes.
So it's like the back roads of the sky connecting those bigger highways and city streets.
Exactly. It's generally found where there's less traffic, like over rural areas or between those busy Class A, B, C, and D airspaces.
Okay, that makes sense.
The main thing to know about flying in Class E is that it's primarily designed for instrument flight rules, but visual flight rules are allowed.
So you could fly visually in Class E, but you'd probably be sharing the airspace with pilots flying by instrument.
Exactly, and the lower altitude limit varies, but in most places it extends up to 18,000 feet.
So it sort of acts like a buffer between the busy lower airspace and that exclusive Class A airspace where the jets fly.
You got to think of it as the transition zone between those back roads and the freeway.
Wow, we've gone from the penthouse suite to the back roads,
Mm.
all while staying within controlled airspace. This airspace cake is much more complex than I ever imagined.
It is, but you're doing a great job navigating it so far.
Well, I have a great guide.
We've still got half the cake left to explore, though. Next up, we'll venture into the world of uncontrolled airspace, where freedom and responsibility go hand in wing.
I'm ready for it. This is fascinating stuff.
It is. We'll be back in a jiffy to explore the rest of that airspace cake.
Okay, so we've tackled controlled airspace. Now let's get into that other half of the cake, the uncontrolled airspace.
Right. Class G, as it's officially known.
And you mentioned it's all about freedom and responsibility.
Exactly.
So what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, think of it this way. Class G airspace is like the wide open spaces of the sky.
Okay, I like that visual.
There are fewer rules and less communication with air traffic control, giving pilots more flexibility.
Okay, more flexibility sounds great.
Okay.
But what about the responsibility part?
Well, imagine you're driving on a country road with fewer traffic signals.
Okay, I'm following you.
You have more freedom to maneuver, but you also need to be extra vigilant about watching out for other vehicles.
Ah, so it's like that see and avoid principle is in full effect in Class G airspace.
Yeah, pilots are primarily responsible for their own navigation and collision avoidance.
So no one is really watching over them, so to speak.
Well, air traffic control might not be actively monitoring or directing traffic in Class G airspace.
Gotcha. So pilots need to be extra careful and really rely on their training and judgment.
Exactly. Thorough pre-flight planning is crucial.
Right. So they need to really study their charts, check the weather conditions,
Absolutely.
be aware of any potential hazards or restricted areas along their route.
All of that. You don't have ATC there to guide you every step of the way.
Now, speaking of restricted areas, you mentioned earlier places where flying is completely prohibited.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me more about those?
Those are called prohibited areas.
Prohibited areas, okay.
And they're established for reasons related to national security or public safety.
So these are like the no-fly zones we hear about in the news.
Exactly. You can't just fly anywhere you want.
Makes sense. I wouldn't want someone buzzing over the White House.
Right. Well, places like Camp David and the National Mall, with all those important government buildings, those are prohibited areas.
Okay, so those are completely off limits. Got it.
Entering one is a serious offense, so pilots need to be absolutely certain they're staying clear.
Don't mess with the prohibited areas.
Right. Now, back to Class G airspace, though. There are some interesting exceptions.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one, Some Class G airports actually have control towers.
Wait, so if a Class G airport has a tower, does that mean it's actually controlled?
It can be a bit tricky. It's still technically Class G airspace. But the presence of a tower means pilots need to communicate with the tower and follow their instructions, just like they would at a controlled airport.
So it's kind of like a hybrid situation?
You could say that.
Still Class G, but with a bit of extra control thrown in?
Precisely, it's important for pilots to be aware of those situations.
Right, makes sense. So what else should pilots be aware of in Class G?
Well, another consideration is ultralight vehicles and unmanned free balloons. They have some special restrictions.
Ultralights and balloons, huh? Okay, tell me more.
Ultralights, for instance, which are basically very small, lightweight aircraft, generally can't operate in Class G airspace near airports unless they have prior authorization from ATC.
Interesting. Why is that? Are they considered more of a safety risk?
It's not so much about being a safety risk, but more about ensuring smooth traffic flow.
I see.
Imagine a tiny ultralight plane trying to share airspace with a jumbo jet. Not a good mix.
Yeah, that would be a bit chaotic.
Right, ultralights are typically much slower than other aircraft, so they can create potential conflicts, especially near busy airports.
Gotcha. So it's all about making sure everyone is playing by the rules and staying out of each other's way.
You got it. And those unmanned free balloons, they're generally prohibited from flying below 2,000 feet within certain areas of Class G airspace that are near airports.
Again, just to minimize the potential for interference with other air traffic.
Exactly. Safety first.
So even in those wide open spaces of Class G, there are still some rules and regulations to keep things running smoothly.
There always are.
It's like driving on a country road. You might not have traffic lights at every intersection, but you still need to follow the rules of the road.
A good analogy. And speaking of rules and regulations, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
Okay, what's that?
Our source material mentioned unmanned aircraft systems, or drones as most people know them.
Drones, yeah, those are everywhere now.
They are. And back in 2016, when this pilot training document was published, future regulations for drones were still in development.
Oh, wow, that's interesting, because I bet those regulations have evolved quite a bit since then.
They have. It's a whole other can of worms, so to speak.
I can imagine. All right, well, we've covered controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, but there's another category we need to talk about.
Okay.
Special use airspace?
Ah, yes, SUA.
So what can you tell me about that?
This is where we get into those zones with specific restrictions or limitations on aircraft operations.
Okay, like, give me some examples. I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty details.
All right, well, remember those prohibited areas we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the no-fly zones.
Those are actually just one type of SUA.
So prohibited areas are a subset of special use airspace.
Exactly. Now, let's say you're flying near a military base and suddenly see signs warning of live fire exercises.
Oh!
You'd better turn around quickly because that's a restricted area.
Restricted area, okay.
And unauthorized entry could be extremely dangerous.
Yikes. I can see why those would be restricted. So prohibited areas are totally off limits. Restricted areas are, well, restricted. What's the difference?
Well, IFR flights, meaning those flying using instruments,
Right.
can sometimes be authorized to transit through restricted areas
Really?
if air traffic control can ensure proper separation from those hazardous activities. But unauthorized entry is a big no-no.
Gotcha. So you could potentially get permission to fly through a restricted area, but only if you're flying under instrument flight rules and have clearance from ATC.
Exactly. It's a very controlled process.
Makes sense. So what other types of SUA should we be aware of?
Well, there are warning areas, which are similar to restricted areas but extend off the coast of the U.S.
So it's like restricted areas, but for activities happening over water.
Pretty much. Then we have military operation areas, or MOAs. These are set aside for military training activities.
Like designated practice zones for the Air Force.
You could say that, and like restricted areas, IFR traffic can be cleared through them if ATC can provide separation.
So there's some overlap there.
Right, then we have alert areas. These are areas where there's a high volume of pilot training or unusual aerial activity going on.
Like flight schools or areas where they're testing new aircraft.
Exactly.
Right.
And while there are a few more types of special use airspace, those are the main ones you should be aware of.
Okay, good to know.
It's important to always check your charts and other resources before you fly to make sure you're aware of any active SUA in your area.
Right, so don't just wing it, pun intended.
Definitely not. Airspace is not the place to be taking shortcuts.
Well, that's a lot of information about special use airspace.
It is a lot to take in.
I'm starting to see why those aviation charts are so detailed.
They have to be. There's a lot going on up there.
We've gone from the penthouse suite of Class A airspace all the way down to the wide open spaces of Class G.
Right.
And now we're navigating a maze of special use areas.
It's a complex system, but that's what makes it so interesting.
It is fascinating, and believe it or not, there are even more airspace considerations we need to touch on.
You're telling me there's more?
Oh yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, I guess we'll have to save those for the final part of our D-dive.
Sounds good, I'm ready for more.
We'll explore some of the more unusual aspects of airspace you might encounter, stuff that you might not even be aware of.
Can't wait, this is really eye-opening. Okay, so we've navigated the controlled airspace, the uncontrolled, and even ventured into those special use areas. What else is there to explore in the world of airspace?
Well, believe it or not, we've still got a few more interesting bits to cover.
Bring 'em on, I'm ready for anything at this point.
All right, so let's talk about those published VFR routes.
VFR routes.
You might see them marked on some aviation charts.
Oh, okay.
Think of them like scenic byways for pilots flying under visual flight rules.
Oh, okay, so like pre-planned routes.
Yeah, designed to help pilots navigate complex airspace, especially around busy airports.
So instead of having to figure out their own route, they can just follow these VFR routes.
Makes things a lot easier and safer, especially for less experienced pilots.
I bet less chance of getting lost or running into trouble.
Exactly. It's like having a guidebook for navigating those tricky areas.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned something earlier called terminal radar service areas.
TRSAs.
Yeah, TRSAs. What are those all about?
Well, these are areas where pilots flying under visual flight rules can get some extra help from air traffic control.
Oh, interesting. So even if I'm just cruising along visually, I can still get some guidance from ATC.
If you want, it's voluntary, but highly recommended.
I bet, especially if you're flying in a busy area.
Exactly. Think of it as an extra layer of safety and awareness.
Like a safety net for VFR pilots.
Pretty much. Especially around busier airports that don't have that complex Class B airspace.
Okay, TRSA's got it. Now, what about those national security areas we briefly touched on?
NSAs, right?
Those sound kind of, I don't know, intimidating.
Well, they're established around sensitive areas like military bases or nuclear power plants,
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
where there's a heightened need for security.
So while flying through an NSA isn't necessarily prohibited, pilots should probably avoid them if possible.
That's the general idea, minimizing any potential risks.
Right, like being a good neighbor and respecting those boundaries.
Exactly. And you might have also heard of Air Defense Identification Zones, or ADIZs.
EDZs, yeah, those ring a bell.
These are areas around the U.S. where aircraft need to follow specific procedures for identification and communication.
Like a security perimeter,
Basically.
making sure we know who's flying in and out of our airspace.
You got it. And speaking of things you might not expect to see in the sky,
Oh, what's that?
remember those giant tethered balloons?
Oh, yeah, the ones used for, like, what was it, weather monitoring?
Yeah, observation, scientific research, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those can extend up to 60,000 feet on cables.
Wow, that's higher than Mount Everest.
They're pretty massive, so pilots definitely need to be aware of them.
I can imagine, make sure they don't have any unexpected encounters.
Yeah, those charts and other resources come in handy for that kind of stuff.
All right, so we've pretty much covered everything. From Class A to Class G, from TFRs to TRSAs, from prohibited zones to giant balloons. My head is officially swimming with airspace knowledge.
It's a lot to take in, but it's all fascinating stuff.
It really is. And I had no idea how much goes into managing the skies above us.
It's a complex system, but it impacts all of us, whether we're pilots or just passengers on this planet.
That's a great point. So what's the biggest takeaway you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, the sky is a shared resource, and everyone who uses it has a responsibility to do so safely.
Couldn't agree more.
Whether you're a pilot, a drone enthusiast, or just someone who enjoys looking up at the clouds.
It's a shared responsibility.
We all have a role to play in keeping our skies safe.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this world.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring.
Yeah, check out those resources we mentioned, those interactive airspace maps.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
Who knows, maybe one day you'll even find yourself behind the controls of an aircraft, navigating this intricate network of highways in the sky.
Until then, happy flying, or at least happy sky watching.
And we'll see you on our next deep dive into a fascinating topic.